Good morning. We are on the Mystery of History, Volume 4. We're on page 19. After this little section on George Whitefield, we're going to take a brief break and read a couple of our scientists in a different book. We have also been reading Science in the Age of Reason, and we've just caught back up to where we were in terms of years. We're going to be looking at Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier. I hope I said that right. Lavoisier was born in 1743, so we have a lot of scientists here in the mid-1700s, and since we're in the mid-1700s with our history, we're going to start doing two scientists and alternating so that we can kind of get through the scientists and our history at the same time. I'm going to look at our history book here because we've got a lot going on in the mid-1700s as well, but I want to kind of get our science done in the mid-1700s. So we're going to we probably will have to do more than two because there are I want to finish them before we get to 1776, which is the founding of our country. Because let's see who is in 1776 in the science book. The science book, we have a lot of 1730s, 1740s. Let's see. I think we pretty much need to finish everybody before we get to, no, just a few at the end. Carl Friedrich Gauss and Nicolas Saussure, Joseph Gay-Lussac, Luigi Brugnatelli. These are difficult names. But yeah, that's in Science of Age of Reason. We could stop when we get to them. So, yeah. Okay, so that's just what we're going to be doing coming up. Right now, we're reading about George Whitefield. We had just read about Jonathan Edwards, or Pastor Jonathan, and he was a part of the Great Awakening, and it was a spiritual revival in the colonies. Now we're moving on to George Whitefield because Jonathan Edwards had contracted smallpox and died from it when he had gone to the College of New Jersey. Not to learn, but to teach. So, George Whitefield was born in England, different from Jonathan Edwards. A lot of these people in the Americas were still born in England at this time and came over later because this was very early on in the establishment of America. George Whitefield was good friends with John Wesley and Charles Wesley. These two brothers were influential in his coming to Christ. George joined a holy club started by Charles Wesley, but would say that he first embraced the gospel when he heard a bishop read John 7:37b. Whenever they put a B there, like if they say 37a, that means the first part of the scripture, or the first part of that verse. They're not actually labeled A and B, but sometimes if you only want to take part of the verse, you will say A or B. The scripture says, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink." George Whitefield grabbed hold of the good news and preached the gospel the rest of his life. Unlike the Wesley brothers, who spent most of their lives in England, George Whitefield traveled back and forth to the New World to preach in the British colonies. Like Jonathan Edwards, whom he befriended, he also saw staggering numbers of people coming to Christ in North America during the years of his ministry. He would get up at 4 in the morning and start preaching as early as 5 a.m. He must have been preaching to the people who were going to work.
I can get up at sometimes I get up at 4 in the morning.
Yeah.
I feel tired,
But
nope.
You haven't had enough sleep. But anyway, even in those early morning hours, hundreds of people gathered to hear him. Benjamin Franklin, who heard George preach on many occasions, said he had a voice like an organ, meaning, the musical organ. It must have been powerful. Whitfield's preaching was so effective that unfortunately some pastors grew jealous of him and asked him to leave their areas. So that's not the unity of the Spirit, is it?
No.
I like what our pastor says, Pastor Mark. He says, it's not the name above the church, it's the name above every name. Basically meaning we're all on the same team here, people. We're not competing. Without access to churches, do you know what he did? He preached in the open air, on the streets of the colonies. So I guess he was kind of like Miss Joyce. Miss Joyce doesn't have a whole church of her own. She'll go to different churches, or she'll preach in like a conference center or a stadium or something. But he's preaching in the open air. On the streets of the colonies, or back home in the mines of England, Whitefield preached of the need to be born again wherever he could. Referring to himself as the servant of all, he gave as many 30,000 sermons before his death. His audiences, meaning the people who listened to him, included American Indians, African slaves, orphans, and he built homes for the orphans near Savannah, Georgia. Whitefield died in Massachusetts in 1770 after his 7th visit to the British colonies. So that term is a little confusing, because it means in America, but it wasn't America at that time. At that time, they were still under Britain. But it can kind of seem like, since I just said he was in America, that he went back to Britain, but he didn't. He's visiting North America, where the colonies for Britain are. Let's see. When did Jonathan Edwards die? So he was 55. When was he born? He was born in 1703, so he died in 1758, about. Okay, so George Whitefield died about 12 years later. Of great significance to Americans, George Whitefield preached to almost all the colonies before his death. In doing so, he began to unite them. Colonists all... See, this is something you miss in the public schools. You don't hear about the fact that part of the reason they started to unite was a Christian preacher. In doing so, he began to unite them. Colonists all up and down the eastern seaboard were drawn together spiritually. Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Anglicans. Whitefield's message was embraced by several denominations. Some would interpret that as divine preparation for what was to come. Do you know what was to come?
The Messiah?
No. The Messiah had already come. This is in the 1700s, so this is after 1700 years after Jesus already came. But he's coming again, but they're talking about the colonies fighting for independence from Britain. The colonies would soon unite after Whitefield's death to fight for independence from England. You see, one of many topics on the minds of the colonists was freedom of conscience, as preached by George Whitefield and other evangelists of the Great Awakening. It says that with appetites whetted for spiritual freedom. I don't really like that phrase. It means they're starting to hunger for spiritual freedom. Colonists were also starting to hunger for political freedom, like freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. I believe, as many others do, that God's providential hand, this is her speaking, not me, Mrs. Hobart, that God's providential hand swept through the colonies during the Great Awakening for significant events to come. Not that I don't believe that, I just don't know enough about it to make an opinion. Okay, so that's the end of that. The next lesson is on Frederick II and the 7 Years' War. Yeah, so that we're going to read first The Scientist, and then we'll come back and read about Frederick and the 7 Years' War. So we're going to try to work some of the scientists in, that the scientific discoveries that were also coming in at the same time. I think that's a better idea, to kind of read science, since the science is organized into history. It's organized as to what happened according to history, that we kind of read it along with our history book. All right, well, that's all that we have for now. Thanks for listening. We hope you have a good day. Bye for now.